the things that I hope to convey is that there's a very different, ethnobiology is supposed to be a hybrid discipline, but it's really anthropologists approach it one way, botanists and biologists approach it the other way. And here's the main difference, the use of the colon. Anthropologists use colons, and much more than we do. And if you doubt that, I did a little statistics, and I went through and randomly picked 100 articles in the American Anthropologist. There were 72 colons there, and economic botany, there were only 32. So we need to start using, we need to coincide with our use of colons. Right. So what I want to show you is, in this, I hope the real lessons from this are to show the influence of people. We talk about ethnobiology of a group, but really you can't do that without looking at their history and the people around and how they've influenced. So I want to look at a particular period of time, a pioneer period in Florida that lasted from the, say, late 1700s until, at least in South Florida, which I'm going to focus on, until the railroad arrived in Miami in 1896. This picture happens to be my grandfather right here. So that was my great-grandfather. I don't know where this was. It was either in North Georgia or somewhere in southern Florida. So we can look at the history of Florida and how it was people. Pre-contact time, there were estimated 350,000 people. That's actually a low estimate. Some people say as high as 1 million indigenous people in the state of Florida. 250 years later, there were essentially zero. So those people, the original inhabitants, particularly the Timucua, the Appalachian, the Calusa, the Tequesta, the largest group, were wiped out, some through warfare, mostly European diseases. And so Florida was a blank slate, and it was repopulated by 3 groups of people. So Africans who had been imported into the New World as slaves started moving into Florida. They moved into Florida because, remember, Florida was Spanish territory, so they were safe from their British masters. And that continued on except for a brief period, 1763 to 1783, when Florida was British. Now, the indigenous population was essentially vacant after this. So then 3 groups, 3 waves of Creek people, a variety of cultures in southern Alabama and Georgia migrated into Florida. Those are the people who became the current-day Seminole and Miccosukee. And then white settlement really took place. There were very few people in Florida until after 1821, and that's when Florida became a U.S. territory. And if you look at the population numbers, I haven't plotted on a log scale, but there's an important concept here. So here you can see the indigenous population that just drops all the way down to about, that's 150 people. So it was 350 million, or 350,000, it went up to about 5,000 or 6,000, and then it went down to 150, maybe 200 people. Nonetheless, those 150 people had pronounced influence on plant use, both within the African American population as well as the white population. So I'm going to, the plants, I apologize, the plants I'm going to talk about are fairly routine, they're boring plants, but I thought about this when I started thinking about what did my grandfather or my great-grandfather, what did they eat? What were their foods, So for some groups, we can go to the literature and we can find that out. We can answer more about that question from some groups in the Amazonia than we can for our own ancestors. And in southern Florida, it's actually different. So of course, in North Florida, it was corn and black-eyed peas were really important. But as we get, here's the other point, the people moving into Florida had a problem. They were temperate people, and as they moved farther and farther south, they got more and more tropical. And so suddenly, everything they learned didn't apply. The foods they grew farther north didn't apply, so they had to relearn. And the question is, where did that come from? So one of the things that came into play was sweet potato became the primary crop. And this was the most important plant for people in extreme southern Florida. There's a quote, "We ate sweet potatoes year-round." One of the alternative uses for sweet potatoes, too, were a coffee substitute. No caffeine in it. Take sweet potatoes, cut it up, you roast it until it's dark, you grind it up, and you can make coffee out of it. Now, up here what I tried to show is the direction of movement, at least from the Seminoles to the white pioneers. The African Americans were somewhat in between. They had been slaves in the southeastern U.S. They moved into Florida. Some of them were enslaved by the Seminoles. The Seminoles kept black slaves. But that relationship is totally it's unclear. It would vary. There were also free blacks who established essentially the Seminole culture, although there were separate communities. But the blacks were important because they carried the information from the slaves and exchanged it with the Native Americans. So in this case, it's probably that it went from whites to Seminole. Akakmoshki means, one of the languages they speak, means essentially white tuber. The first part is aha, and moshki means sweet, so it was a sweet tuber. Another one that probably went from whites to the Seminoles is this common pumpkin. There's another pumpkin I'll talk about. And this was absolutely a crucial crop because one, you could store it even in the hot, humid Florida winter, you could store it for a long while. There's a great quote that, from a guy named Pierce, Charles Pierce, who writes about his life and his family's life in Lake Worth, Florida, from about 1895 until 1920. And along with the cabbage palm, the meristem of sable palmetto, and pumpkins kept the family alive for several weeks. Now the Seminoles had their own pumpkin too. And there's actually people in the society who have studied this. Gary Knapp has done work with this, trying to reestablish that. And this is called Chahassawiska. And that's actually the Creek name. It didn't even make it into the Miccosukee name all the way down into South Florida. And everybody loved this pumpkin. And supposedly it was different because it grew on trees. So people would come in, white, black, or Seminole. They would take an oak tree, girdle it, let it die, plant the pumpkin grows up, and it was a really bizarre sight. Bartram described it, for example. So you'd see a tree with these pumpkins hanging down, but the flesh apparently was delicious and prized by everyone. Sugarcane is another one that was introduced probably from the whites, although it could have persisted from Spanish exploration. That's not quite known. But linguistically, again, the name is much more suggestive of an introduced plant, because there weren't anything called mushki common in the Seminole plant. So this akkamushki means literally cane is sweet. So here's a sugarcane field in southern Florida, again, a staple crop, but a staple for two reasons. You needed sugar, you needed sweetener, but you could also convert it into alcohol. So almost every farmstead had a sugarcane press. Last night I ran out to the entrance to the park where they have the homestead, Pioneer Homestead, and they had not a sugarcane press, but a sorghum press there. So doing the same thing up here. And this is just a total aside. Here is a illustration by an anthropologist from the late 1800s on a Seminole sugarcane press. They learned that from the whites. But here's a sugarcane press in lowland Ecuador, on the Pacific coast of Ecuador, that the Chachis adopted. And you look at this, these are almost identical, with the exception they have 3 wheels, this only has 2. And again, the knowledge of the wood was important, the rollers were live oak. But then they picked up this tropical hardwood mastic in the Sapotasi, Cineroxylum fetidissimum, that is a very hard wood and is great for the cogs of the wheel. Of course, one of the really important plants that went from the Seminole culture to the whites was cabbage palm or sable palmetto. Lots of uses for this. This is the state tree of Florida, of course, but if you read the historical records, they talk about cabbage houses. You just read that, what the heck is a cabbage house? I hope there's no rabbits here anymore. But the cabbage house referred to the structure made with cabbage palm leaves. But unlike the Seminole structures, they had the sides of the house covered with cabbage palms as well. Interestingly, in North Florida, the Seminoles didn't make this. So they're moving from the temperate zone to the tropics. They had to learn a new housing construction, probably from some remnants of the indigenous people. And of course, you can eat the meristem, and the fruits are an emergency food. We just heard about pines and how important they are. So pine, particularly slash pine in southern Florida, Pinus tita drops out, Pinus longleaf pine, Pinus palustra makes it not quite to where the Seminoles are now. It drops off in Palm Beach County on the east coast and Lee County on the west coast. Their name for pine is chula. Both Seminoles, the pioneers and the Seminoles used this plant as a primary construction material in South Florida. Lots of other uses for it. So as a housing material, here's a bit of irony. In North Florida, again, the Seminoles are making log cabins that would look like something like this. They get to South Florida and they use cabbage palm thatch, and then that was adapted by the people who made log cabins in the northern kingdom of Florida. Another use for it is for lighter wood. If you read anything about the South, you read about fire hunting. So fire hunting, you would take light, before there was kerosene and coal oil, you would take a splint of fat wood from pine, put it in a little bowl, hold it out on a stick, and the deer in the headlights scenario ensues. Another really typical southern use that at least one person in this room knows, Cassandra knows this, is rosin potatoes, where you take a pot of rosin to cook your potatoes, you heat that up, drop them in, pull the potatoes off, they harden, you crack it off, and you get some delicious potato. And something that I don't think anybody's described was the very first railroad in southern Florida. It was a short railroad, I think it was about 8 miles long. It was called it was commonly called the Celestial Railroad because it went between 2 points, Jupiter, Florida, and a place called Neptune Beach. So they called it the Celestial Railroad. There was no coal in Florida, so they used pine. So to make extra money, you could go and cut a few cords of wood, put it by the side of the railroad, and collect your pay later on. Of course, the Seminoles had a lot more uses for pine. It was a very important species. They have a complex medicine called the ketchahekek, which includes things like popash, live oak, ficus, citrifolia, and a couple of other things, and also pines. They also made it use it by stickball. This happens to be a cypress bowl. They made baskets out of it. Now, the baskets, I'm not going to talk about sweetgrass baskets that the Seminoles are famous for, but they really learned that from the Africans, so Guala people from South Carolina and Georgia who came down there. So real cultural exchange. The other thing, this is not a Seminole picture. I don't have any good pictures of it. This is a recreation of Tequesta. But you can see some ritual scarification. The Seminoles did this, but they did it with a lot of things. They took ficus, they would light the latex on fire, or they would take pine and light that on fire. And they put these scars on the inside of their arms. That was believed to light their way when they passed on and moved on to the next world. So very important plant, more so in the ritual sense for the Seminoles than for the pioneers. Another important plant, essential plant South Florida, was Taxodium disticum cypress. It was of course, it was the primary way people got around. It was a long time till Florida had roads. Florida's too wet. We already heard it talk about the St. Johns River and all the water. Florida gets its water budget is 175 billion gallons per day. Just so it's a wet state. Not many places that you could go without coming before drainage. So Seminoles made dugout canoes out of cypress. They used other things too, but this was the preferred. Here's a fairly recent canoe. Only one guy left that knows how to make dugout canoes. Also used for building their chickees. Now here the pioneers come to South Florida, and this is a house of refuge. There are lots of shipwrecks along the coast. Most people died of shipwrecks, not from the shipwreck itself. They got to the coast, they couldn't find water, so they starved, they died of thirst or hunger. So that what became the Coast Guard erected 5 houses of refuge along the coast, built with pine, but the roofs were made with cypress shingles, very good material. Although there's one account of it a young boy who moved into one of these houses, and he said that water tasted like medicine, so water was collected off the cisterns. Another thing that took me a while to figure out was a meat safe. Cypress was preferred wood for a meat safe. No refrigeration. You're in a subtropical, approaching tropical climate. So you kill game, you kill your hog, shoot a deer, you cover it with sulfur, and then combined with the screening and the terpenoids in cypress, it would preserve the meat for some time, a certain time. A fairly recent plant was coconut. We can partly tell that from the name. The Seminole name for cabbage palm is Ta'choget, which means like Okeechobee means big water. Chobit means big. So ta'a is a word for palm. But this is a weird name. This is a weird name. It means essentially rattle palm. So what happened, we saw, when we went, those of you who went to the Cherokee Museum saw some rattles and saw the ox turtle rattles. That's what the Seminoles originally used. Then when coconuts came in, they called this the rattle palm because they can make rattles out of it. But then that was replaced shortly. That was replaced by Borden's condensed milk. They liked that a lot better because it made a much louder, when it was lighter probably, but it made a much larger, a louder sound. So the problem with coconuts probably came into Florida in the 1800s. I don't think they persisted because there was always interest when a ship wrecked on the coast that had coconuts. Coconuts are cold sensitive, they probably used multiple times. And the last plant I'll talk about was a major food crop. It's called, in Miccosukee language, coontie. That actually comes from the word Quebec. At first it was applied to smilax fruits. When the Seminoles migrated into South Florida, they found another tuber, totally unrelated, that they could use for a starch source. And lots of plants go into processing of that, including a pine log, and usually the pestle made out of the mastic wood. Ficus aurea, particularly, are strained with it, really common, made a washing pan to clean that. And then it was sieved, sometimes through cloth, but often from baskets that were, again, double woven, like we heard about the day before. So coontie, here's a great quote. Every pioneer family, white and black, dug the roots. That was food, that was emergency food. It was money in the bank. If things got bad, you could always go out and find some coontie. And finally, I want to end with a story. I found this story quite accidentally. I was rereading a book called Swanee, A Strange Green Land. I read it a long time before and didn't make sense of it. And I couldn't find very much out about the author, Cecil Huss Mashat. Turns out she was an ethnographer. I could tell by her writing she knew the people. She took a trip from the Okefenokee Swamp down the Suwannee River, and she stopped at an old plantation, and there were some Africans who had been enslaved there, or at least their parents had. Certainly they had that cultural memory, and they told her the story about the origin of coontie. And the story is, I don't have time to give it fully, but essentially coontie was a big plant in the legend. It was a great big plant, had these leaves. And Sister Coontie, though, wouldn't share her leaves with the people. So Brer Rabbit got mad and went up to heaven, and God said, "How are you making it, Brer Rabbit?" And Brer Rabbit said, "I'm not doing so good." It tells about Sister Coontie refusing to share. So God said, "Okay, I'm going to make persimmon for you." So he made persimmon for them to eat. Problem was Sister Coontie shaded out the persimmon. So Brer Rabbit goes back, complains to God that, "Oh, Sister Cinnamon is really messing with us, Lord. You got to do something." So God got mad. He said, "Okay, coontie, no longer are you a big plant, you're a little plant. And on top of that, I'm going to make your roots edible. So since you killed persimmon, you're going to provide food for the people." Now, great story, incorporating lots of different things. But the amazing thing, here we have an African legend talking about a Seminole plant, Kutuki. So we can take it. So where does that come from? And also, it doesn't make any sense because there's no coontie above about half a meter in Florida. They're talking about Sister Coontie, 2 meters high. Where did it come from? It came from Africa. So they wove a legend that they had about Xania, or probably not Xania, it's Sublartos, another cycad. They come to the New World. There's not the cycad. They still have the collective memory of these big cycads, but now they're little. They combine that with Brer Rabbit's story to talk about the origin of 2 plants. Thank you.